2, 1.
First, let's set the stage. The international stage! Scholars, politicians, and laypeople alike hold their breaths as they watch the battle between two global superpowers, China and the US. The US has been the global hegemon since World War II. No one has challenged its position. No one has even come close. Until China. See, for the past few decades, China has been rivaling the US's strength in terms of political leverage, military, and economy. But this video is about a small island stuck between this great power competition, Taiwan. You see, Taiwan is caught between trying to mitigate the fury and possessiveness of its overbearing neighbor China, while at the same time trying to appeal to the United States in order to garner military support. But then how does Taiwan navigate this tightrope between the US and China while at the same time trying to ensure its own security and make a name for itself? This is a particularly interesting dilemma for Taiwan in the face of China's wolf warrior diplomacy. Wolf warrior diplomacy? What's that? Patience, please. I was just getting to that. Since the mid-2010s, China's diplomacy has been deemed the wolf warrior diplomacy, and it's inspired by the highest grossing film in China called Wolf Warrior. So the movie is about a macho military Chinese man who slays evil American mercenary forces, saves the world, and wins glory for China. So essentially, the term wolf warrior diplomacy signals Chinese leaders and diplomats' turn towards a more aggressive, macho, hostile, and confrontational form of diplomacy.
Wait, so did Taiwan make their cat warrior diplomacy in response to China's wolf warrior diplomacy?
Exactly. In an interview with The Economist in 2023, Vice President of Taiwan, Kim, announced her new philosophy for Taiwan's diplomacy, which is to embody a cat warrior in the face of China's aggressive wolf warriors. Now, the key traits that characterize Taiwan as a cat warrior is its nimble, flexible approach to navigating narrow spaces on the international stage. Now, she also says that cats are more lovable than wolves, and in diplomacy, it's all about making friends. Now, Xiao also says that Taiwan is embracing a warm, cuddly, and welcoming nature.
That's great and all. But how does Taiwan being cute and cuddly like a cat help it compete against China's military might?
That's a great point if you're only considering power from a realist standpoint. You see, realism is the leading theoretical lens in international relations, and all of the most prominent realist scholars, from Hobbes to Morgenthau, define power as the ability to get one to submit to your will. In other words, power is domination.
How does one nation dominate another?
Through muscles and might, otherwise known as a robust military. But my question is, what if we view international relations and this question of power not through a realist lens, but through a feminist lens? One of feminism's primary goals is to analyze power, to challenge our preconceived notions of power, and ultimately to redefine what power looks like. Its military is dwarfed by China, and it doesn't practice any of the aggressive tactics that China does on the international stage. But perhaps through a feminist lens, Taiwan does have the ability to obtain and demonstrate power. So I ask, what are the feminist reconceptions of power in Taiwan's cat warrior diplomacy? So I did the hard work for you and analyzed a bunch of speeches by Taiwanese leaders. In the speeches of Tsai Ing-wen, Kim, and Lai Ching-te, they emphasized in their speeches, number one, making friends and relying on the international community for support. Number 2, sharing the same goals as a lot of the liberal democracies around the world. Number 3, never utilizing offensive military tactics and only relying on self-defense. And number 4, lending a hand to the world whenever they are in need. Now, what might some feminists say about power in these cases? First, it's important to address one big question. Is Taiwan a country? Taiwan is a de facto independent nation that operates with its own government, laws, and political system separate from China. However, it is not formally recognized by most of the countries as a state, and it is barred from political participation in many international organizations. So no, Taiwan is not a country, formally. Because of this, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, asserts that Taiwan is simply a breakaway province that is undoubtedly a part of China. But because Taiwan does not have formal recognition as a state, even though it has all the qualifications of being a state, China is very confident in claiming Taiwan and subordinating it. This circular logic is reminiscent of Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, when he asserts that women are not actual full human beings because they're just instruments to men. Susan Miller Okin, a feminist scholar, critiques this circular logic because if you classify women as non-humans and then measure them up to all the male values, then of course they're going to fall short. And so, because women fall short on the scale of male values, it's easy to be able to deem women as inferior to men or the property of them. The same way it's easy to deem Taiwan the property of China. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, I want to talk about the fact that some feminist scholars actually still do define power as domination, such as Carol Pateman in The Sexual Contract. Carol Pateman argues that the actual original contract, the original pact, is one between men and women in which men assert their dominance over women. In general, this manifests in men's control over women's bodies, but also it manifests in subcontracts of this original pact, such as in marriage, where women and children are the property of their husband. In this way, we could remark about the parallels between the relationship of China and Taiwan. In Xi's speeches, he talks about Taiwan as if it's the rightful property of China and something that China has full ownership over. And so, in the question of Taiwanese reunification with the mainland, he calls it an inevitability. Calling to Iris Marion Young, another feminist scholar's logic of masculinist protection, she makes the argument that the US becomes somewhat of a masculine protector archetype to its citizens after 9/11. A similar argument can be made for China and the patriarchal control it exercises over Taiwan. Okay, so now back to the original question, what are some feminist reconceptions of power? First, I'm going to start with Shayla Benhabib's reading on Carol Gilligan's Ethics of Care. What is the ethics of care? A male psychologist named Kohlberg created a theory of moral development which excluded women from ever being able to obtain the highest level of morality according to his metrics. Carol Gilligan found that problematic, so she created a different framework to view morality through, which is through her ethics of care rather than his ethics of justice. She found that context, specificity, concern, and care for others permeated the responses of the female participants in her moral development experiments. Benhabib takes this idea a bit further with the concepts of the generalized versus the concrete other. In Kohlberg's theory of moral development, as well as many different Western male theorists, they view people as the generalized other, as in they have the same rights and abilities and obligations and duties as him, and they're generally nameless, faceless, vague, abstract concepts that you don't really care who they really are. On the other hand, with the concrete other, we are inclined to view people with context, specificity, and a knowledge about their particular history and identity. What does this have to do with Taiwan? Well, in the framework of the concrete other, there's this idea of complementary reciprocity. And it basically states that people should be expected to meet the specific needs of others based on their specific identities. In this case, in the speeches of those Taiwanese leaders, they always emphasize Taiwan's unique position on the world stage of being possessed by their overbearing neighbor and also wanting to appeal to the rest of the world. Benababe also posits this idea of communicative ethics in which we undergo actual dialogue with the people around us in order to strive towards a positive outcome. This emphasis on communication and dialogue is present all throughout Taiwanese leaders' speeches, where they call for dialogue with China in order to solve cross-strait tensions and completely renounce the use of force. Now, this emphasis on dialogue brings me to two scholars who talk about what the best way to engage in dialogue is. Johnson and Porth create the solidaristic normative theory. It takes into account the specific lived experiences of the people they're studying in a humanizing way. One crucial aspect of this type of theorizing and communication is emphasizing accountability, reflexivity, and building ongoing relationships. While IR is not necessarily about the relationship between researchers and their subjects, I believe that Taiwan is still undergoing this reflexivity, accountability, and specifically building ongoing relationships. Taiwan has nurtured close friendships and informal alliances with countries all across the world, such as in their new southbound policy with many Southeast Asian nations, and of course with its biggest and longest standing ally, the United States. Because of the two nations' long-standing relationship, they have been able to foster so much cultural exchange, and the US has been able to provide a lot of much-needed military and financial support to Taiwan. I argue that Taiwan's relationships with countries across the world wouldn't be possible if they weren't constantly sparking dialogue and building ongoing relationships. Now, everything I'm talking about, from communicative ethics to dialoguing in solidarity to working with others to complementary reciprocity, all of this is what Amy Allen, a feminist scholar who studies power, might classify as power as empowerment. And so that's one big way in which a feminist's redefinition of power is different from realism's definition of power as domination. This concept of empowerment is further emphasized in feminist scholar Stacy Simplican's work on disabled people and their political participation. While some theorists and philosophers believe that disabled people do not have the capacity to participate in politics or are altogether subhuman, Simplican challenges this notion in many ways. She says that disabled people aren't powerless, they just participate in politics in different ways than the normally functioning individual. I want to extend this argument to Taiwan. How does it practice self-advocacy and empowerment in alternate forms? Simplican draws on Hannah Arendt for alternate conceptions of power. Arendt states that power is not just acting, but acting in concert, being in plurality with other people. That means being in the presence of other people, working with other people, dialoguing with people, working together and building this web of human relationships. That is where true power is derived from. Last, I want to tackle this question: is Taiwan's alternate forms of power that it displays in its cat warrior diplomacy actually working? Is it actually succeeding? In a lot of ways, yes. Taiwan has been separate from China for more than 50 years. It's been able to escape the claws of its overbearing neighbor, at the same time garnering support from the entire international community. Now you might be wondering, what's the final end goal for Taiwan? Does it want to achieve formal independence? Does it want to have formal statehood? The answer is not so clear-cut. Perhaps Taiwan isn't necessarily striving for the end goal of formal statehood. However, it is always in the process of actively defending its freedom and autonomy. And I argue that it is always coming up with more creative and feminist ways to tackle this issue. This reminds me of a couple of other feminist scholars, Gina Starblanket, Leanne Simpson, and Robin Maynard, who wrote a book called Rehearsals for Living. They argue that in order to keep indigenous feminisms alive, they must always be actively working together, doing mutual aid, organizing and building relationships. So doing this survival thing right might take visioning, dreaming, and imagination and creative sovereignty from the part of Taiwan. And it makes sense because that is how Taiwan survived until now. Taiwan has been able to survive by acting, as Shelby Kim said, like a cat. Nimble, flexible, and always able to navigate narrow spaces.